Welcome to another video coverage of This Week on Rails. I'm Dave Kimura, and today we have Wojtek bringing us the updates. I don't produce this newsletter, I simply provide this video coverage of it. So if you would like to check out the email copy of this, you can go to rubyonrails.org/newsletter to receive your own copy. So let's go ahead and dive right in. For the first item, update Action View to use HTML5 standards compliant sanitizers. And so this is a great one because if you've ever tried to implement your own WYSIWYG editor, then you'll quickly find that most of them by default will have security issues, meaning that you can do cross-site scripting and that kind of stuff. And a lot of the motivation behind this one is that the libxml2 library hasn't been really keeping up to date with the HTML5 standards, and so this is a replacement for that library when using the sanitized vendor Rails HTML5 sanitizer versus the Rails HTML4. But there is a little gotcha with this, where I think if you're using JRuby, then the HTML5 won't be supported. We can verify that if we look at the gem Rails HTML sanitizer, where all these sanitizers respond to sanitize, and you can use the variants HTML4 or 5. However, note that the HTML5 sanitizers are not supported on JRuby. And the next one, add path params to URL4. And so we're getting this new option, path params. And if you have situations where you have a required parameter that's part of the route's URL, but then you have other routes or other links that really don't need that, or the extra stuff that's part of the params, then we have this path params option. So the use case for this is that, let's say you have an application, and within this application, you need the account ID basically for every request. And so you have a default URL options in your application controller, and within there, you have a hash where you have the account ID, setting it to the current .account ID. And so in this particular scenario, if you have a sign out path or something similar, then it's going to pass the account ID as well, and that's not really needed in that particular context. So with the path params, if you have your default URL options again, you can pass a path params and then your hash of the account ID and then the current account ID. And so with this change, you can see how it's going to affect the URL generation. And for the next item, assign auto-populated columns on active record object creation. And this is a bit of an interesting one because if you have situations where you have a primary key, but then you're also setting the auto increment and you're doing some other generation, then you would expect it to create normally like this. However, at the moment, MySQL and SQLite adapters are limited to only one column being populated, and the column must be the auto increment. And so this is a bit of an interesting one. I've never had to create an auto increment while supplying the ID false, and then have a different field for the primary key. But I'd be interested to hear some of the use cases that you may have for doing something like this. In the next one, we have the sanitize options as being added in the simple format helper. So if you've ever had to use something like simple format and then provided a string with some HTML content, you'll have a target blank for that link, and then you'll have the href. However, the simple format will remove that target blank, and you'll just have the href instead. And so with this change, you're going to be able to use that simple format, but then pass in the sanitize options, and then with the attributes, target and href, and in this case, you would get the generated string with that target and the href for those attributes. And for the next item, set default shard from connects to hash. And this is if you are sharding with your database, you need to have some kind of default shard, and by default, Rails will use default as the shard name in the connection model. However, if you don't want to use that shard name, then within the connects to, you can set your own default shard name. And for the next item, we are getting the add health check configuration. So within your configuration, you can set the health check path. And so the use case for this is if you were deploying Action Cable as a standalone option, then you're going to lose that Rails ties health check path. And for the next one, support the visual environment variable and prefer it over editor. And this is one of those changes where you didn't even really know you needed it, you just learned to live with what you were given. So if you were trying to edit the credentials file, then you would have to specify the editor and then whichever editor you want to use, whether it's Vim, VS Code, or something similar, and then add the -- wait. However, that editor environment variable was really meant for use with non-advanced editors. And so if you already have your editor environment variable set and you're just happy with the way it works, then this pull request really won't change anything, because it will still look for the editor environment variable. However, if you have visual set, then it'll prefer that over the editor. And for the next one, allow the active storage attachment to be removed via a form post. And so when you're making a form post, you can't really pass nil into the form. A nil would just get omitted. And if you were to pass an empty string, then you would get an invalid signature message. And so now, whether you're using an empty string or a nil, and you're passing it into the Rails application via a form post or something, then that will actively remove the active storage attachment. So remember, you can't do a nil with the form post, that would just get omitted. But if you change it to an empty string, then that will get posted through and then delete your attachment. So I'm not expecting this to change any of the default behavior that we have today. However, if you wanted a way to easily delete your uploaded file, then you're going to be able to do this with an empty string instead. And so over the past week, there are 27 contributors to Rails, and so I really appreciate everyone's efforts and all that they have done to help make Rails just a much better framework. And especially to those first-time contributors, so thank you again. Well, that's all for this week's video coverage of This Week in Rails. Thanks for watching.